Claire adjusted her chair, glancing around Dr. Reynolds's office as if today might hold something different. She had been attending therapy for months, untangling her life's disappointments, the loneliness that clung to her after years of quiet heartbreak, and the faint regrets of choices she hadn't dared to make. She usually found solace in these sessions, a place where she could speak freely, vent her frustrations, and leave with a sense of relief. But today, as the clock ticked and the door remained closed, she sensed a subtle change in the air. The quiet was broken by a soft knock, and then the door opened. A man stepped inside, someone Claire had never seen before. He had a confident energy that seemed to fill the room immediately, a presence that was both commanding and approachable. "This is Ethan," Dr. Reynolds introduced him. "He's a new client who will be joining some of our group sessions." Claire nodded politely, hiding the sudden jolt of curiosity that shot through her. He smiled lightly, a warmth in his eyes that seemed to pierce through the usual clinical atmosphere of the office. Claire felt a strange flutter in her chest. She told herself it was nothing, just her mind noticing a new person. Yet she couldn't help but study his calm confidence, the ease with which he carried himself, and the hint of mischief that lingered behind his smile. It made her heart skip in a way she hadn't expected in a therapy session. She reminded herself this was professional, that boundaries were important, but even so, there was a pull she couldn't quite name. Dr. Reynolds explained that occasionally they might share a group session designed to explore interpersonal dynamics and emotional responses. Claire nodded, though her mind was already spinning with curiosity. The session began, and she focused on her own thoughts, trying to keep her attention on the exercises. But she couldn't ignore Ethan. He spoke with an honesty that was both raw and refreshing. There was no filter, no careful choice of words to impress the therapist or others in the room, just openness. It was unusual, and it drew her in. He laughed easily at moments she hadn't expected, revealing a side of him that was playful and spontaneous. Claire found herself chuckling at his comments, feeling a connection that had nothing to do with romance, yet carried a strange, undeniable intensity. There was an energy about him that awakened something in her, a sense of life and unpredictability she hadn't realized she had been missing. During the session, Claire caught herself watching him in small, subtle ways, how he gestured with his hands, the way he leaned in slightly when he spoke, the thoughtful pauses he took. Each movement, each expression seemed deliberate yet natural, drawing her attention and stirring emotions she hadn't felt in years. She felt a curious mix of admiration and intrigue, tinged with a nervous excitement she tried to suppress. By the end of the session, Dr. Reynolds wrapped up the group discussion, and Ethan's presence lingered in Claire's mind. She left the office walking a little slower than usual, thinking over his words, the way he expressed himself, and the quiet confidence he carried. There was a tension she hadn't felt before in a therapy setting, not inappropriate, but charged in a way that made her pulse quicken. That evening, Claire sat in her apartment, reflecting on the encounter. She thought about the way Ethan seemed to challenge the norms she had placed around her life, how his presence had stirred curiosity, and how easily he had broken through the usual walls she maintained with strangers. It was thrilling, confusing, and a little frightening all at once. She wondered if she had been too long in her structured, predictable routines, missing the spark of unpredictable connection that made life feel alive. Her thoughts wandered to the idea, risked, not reckless risk, but the kind that comes with opening oneself to unexpected possibilities. Ethan had arrived quietly, simply sitting in a room, speaking with honesty. And yet he had created a small whirlwind inside her. Claire couldn't name it exactly, but she knew it was significant. Something had shifted subtly but unmistakably as she prepared for bed. She caught herself smiling at the memory of his expressions, the lightness in his laughter, the sharp intelligence in his observations. There was a pull she hadn't felt in a long time, an awakening of curiosity and awareness of life's unpredictability. She realized she was already anticipating the next session, the next shared space, and the next conversation with a mix of excitement and nervousness. She closed her eyes that night with a quiet acknowledgement that something had changed in her, an emotional stir that was innocent yet intense, a connection that was still professional but carried layers of intrigue, warmth, and subtle admiration. She didn't know what this new dynamic would bring, only that it had already begun to leave a mark. Claire's life, usually predictable, felt a little larger, a little wilder, and a little more alive than it had in months. The arrival of Ethan was just a single moment, one that could have been ordinary. But for Claire, it was extraordinary, the first ripple of something that could grow into something far more profound if nurtured with care, awareness, and honesty. The following week, Claire walked into Dr. Reynolds' office feeling strangely anxious. It wasn't the usual kind of therapy, nerves, it was anticipation. She tried to tell herself it was curiosity, not excitement, but the small flutter in her chest told her otherwise. She had dressed a little differently that morning, choosing a soft blue blouse and her favorite earrings. She didn't want to admit it to herself, but some part of her wondered if Ethan would notice. When she entered, Ethan was already there, leaning back slightly in his chair, flipping through the notebook he brought to every session. He looked up as soon as she walked in and smiled, a simple, genuine smile that made her pulse skip. "Hey, Claire," he said easily, as though they were old friends. The casual warmth in his tone threw her off for a second, but she returned the greeting. Trying to sound calm, Dr. Reynolds began the session as usual, discussing emotional triggers, relationship patterns, and the boundaries people often fail to set. But Claire found it difficult to focus. Every time Ethan spoke, his voice drew her in. There was something grounded in the way he expressed himself, raw honesty mixed with humor. He wasn't afraid to expose his vulnerabilities, and that made him magnetic. As others in the small group shared their stories, Ethan listened with rare attentiveness. When Claire spoke about her tendency to hold back emotions out of fear of judgment, he didn't interrupt or offer advice. He simply looked at her, nodding as if he understood every word. That small gesture felt more validating than any therapy advice she'd ever received. After the session ended, everyone began to pack up, but Ethan lingered. Claire noticed it immediately. Dr. Reynolds excused herself to take a call, leaving them in the quiet room. Ethan turned to her, his tone light but sincere. "You speak about emotions like someone who's been through a storm," he said, "but you still talk about hope. That's rare." The words caught her off guard. She smiled softly, trying to brush it off. "Maybe I just talk too much." He shook his head. "No, you just talk honestly. People don't do that anymore." There was a brief silence, not uncomfortable, but charged with an awareness neither wanted to name. When Dr. Reynolds returned, the moment faded, but something had shifted. Claire left the building that day with an odd mix of peace and confusion swirling inside her. Later that evening, while making tea, she found herself replaying their conversation. There had been nothing inappropriate. No lines crossed, just words. But those words had settled somewhere deep, reminding her of what it felt like to be seen and understood without judgment. She couldn't remember the last time someone made her feel that way. The next week, Dr. Reynolds announced that she'd be out of town for a seminar and offered to postpone sessions. But Ethan suggested something unexpected. "Why don't we meet at the cafe near the park? Just to talk, not therapy. It's strange not having a group this week." Claire hesitated. It wasn't therapy. It wasn't formal. But she found herself agreeing before her mind could talk her out of it. When she arrived at the cafe, Ethan was already there, sitting by the window, sunlight filtering through the glass behind him. He waved her over with that same easy smile that seemed to calm and disarm her at once. Their conversation flowed naturally from books and movies to deeper topics, like second chances and regrets. Ethan shared stories about his failed relationships, how he often sabotaged things when they got too serious. "I think people mistake comfort for connection," he said. "They settle because it's easier than facing loneliness." Claire listened, realizing how much truth his words carried. She had done the same, settled for comfort, not connection. Their talk stretched for hours, and when it finally ended, both were surprised at how much time had passed. As they stepped outside, Ethan looked at her for a long moment. "You're not like most people I meet," he said quietly. "You don't just listen, you see people." The words lingered between them, And for the first time in years, Claire didn't deflect the compliment. She simply smiled, her heart quietly acknowledging something new on emotional closeness she hadn't felt in years. Over the next few weeks, Claire and Ethan's paths continued to cross, both inside and outside therapy sessions. Their connection deepened in subtle, meaningful ways. He'd ask about her art, remembering details from their conversations. She'd notice his thoughtful pauses, the way he seemed to weigh his words before speaking. Dr. Reynolds encouraged open dialogue in sessions, often pairing them for discussions about trust and emotional growth. Claire couldn't help but feel that the doctor saw the spark between them but trusted their maturity to keep things respectful. One afternoon, during a session on personal fears, Ethan spoke about the pain of being misunderstood. His words struck a chord in Claire, stirring memories she thought she had buried long ago, times when she had been dismissed, or overlooked, or judged for showing emotion. She found herself speaking up, her voice shaking slightly as she confessed how tired she was of pretending everything was fine. Ethan listened, his gaze unwavering. When she finished, there was a quiet moment, and then he said softly, "Maybe that's your strength. You keep showing up, even when it hurts." The sincerity in his voice made her throat tighten. It wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it, with an empathy that felt rare and genuine. By the time the session ended, Claire felt emotionally exposed, but not in a bad way. She realized Ethan's presence had become something steady in her life, a mirror reflecting both her vulnerability and her courage. That night, she couldn't stop thinking about how easy it was to talk to him, how safe she felt in his company. But mixed with that safety was a growing tension, an awareness that bordered on dangerous. It wasn't attraction in the typical sense, it was emotional gravity. Something beyond logic or reason. She told herself it was just connection. That therapy bonds were often intense, that it would fade once sessions ended. But deep down, she knew this was different. There was something unspoken building between them, something neither dared to name yet couldn't ignore. Weeks passed, and Claire noticed Ethan starting to change too. He became more reflective, less guarded. He'd talk about growth, about trying to be better, about how his conversations with her made him rethink his choices. They weren't flirting, they were learning each other's truths, finding comfort in mutual honesty. Still, there were moments, the kind of moments that made the air feel heavier. When their eyes met across the room and lingered a second too long. When a smile carried more meaning than words could express. When silence said everything they couldn't say aloud. By the end of another session, Dr. Reynolds assigned a closing reflection exercise to write a letter to oneself about the person they had become. Claire went home that night and wrote about rediscovering her strength, her heart, and her capacity for connection. But when she finished, she realized Ethan's presence had become a part of that transformation. The next time she saw him, she wanted to thank him for listening, for understanding, for being there. But as she stood in front of him, words failed her. He looked at her with that same patient warmth. And in that brief exchange, she felt everything she couldn't say out loud. As they left the building that day, Claire realized something with quiet certainty. Meeting Ethan had not been a coincidence. He had walked into her life when she least expected it, challenging her to feel again, to open her heart, and to remember that connection, even in unexpected places, can change everything. And yet, beneath all the calm understanding and quiet gratitude, there was something she didn't want to admit, something waiting for the right moment to surface. A new storm was coming, Kate, and neither of them could stop it. A month later, Claire's life had changed more than she cared to admit. Her weekly therapy sessions were no longer just about healing her past. They had become moments of reflection, a quiet bridge connecting her to something she hadn't expected. Ethan, his presence, steady and calm, had become a rhythm she'd grown used to. But beneath that calm ran something deeper, something neither of them dared to touch. Dr. Reynolds had begun introducing new exercises, ones that required deeper emotional openness between participants. One day, she asked them to pair up and share the most defining moment of their lives, something that shaped who they were today. Claire hesitated, unsure if she wanted to expose her most personal memory in front of Ethan. But when she met his gaze across the room, she felt that strange sense of trust return. They sat across from each other, the air thick with unspoken tension. Claire took a deep breath and began to talk. She spoke about her marriage, the quiet distance that grew over time, the sense of invisibility that settled in her heart. She didn't paint her ex-husband as cruel, just absent. Emotionally, gone. "It's like living with a ghost," she said softly. "You stop expecting warmth because you forget what it feels like." Ethan listened quietly, his expression pained as though her words touched something in him. When she finished, he didn't rush to speak. He looked at her for a long moment before saying, "You didn't deserve that. No one does." Then it was his turn. He told her about the mistakes he'd made, how he'd built walls out of fear, how he used charm to hide his insecurity, how he'd walked away from people who cared because it was easier than being honest. His voice cracked slightly when he said, "I thought being alone was safer, until I realized it was just emptier." Claire's heart ached as she listened. It wasn't pity, was recognition. There were two people carrying different versions of the same loneliness that night. As Claire drove home, she couldn't shake the memory of Ethan's voice, the vulnerability in it. It was strange, she thought, how someone could walk into your life as a stranger and, in weeks, feel like they'd known your soul for years. The next few sessions deepened that feeling. There were no grand gestures or forbidden words, just glances, moments of understanding, quiet empathy. Ethan had become her mirror. And though Claire knew it was risky to feel this connected, she couldn't help it. The emotions were growing roots before she even realized it. One afternoon, Dr. Reynolds asked to see Claire privately after a session. Her tone was kind but serious. "Claire, I've noticed something between you and Ethan," she said gently. "There's a strong emotional exchange. That can be healing, but it can also blur lines. Be mindful of your boundaries." Claire felt her cheeks warm. "It's not like that," she insisted. Though she knew, even as she said it, that her feelings had gone beyond friendship the following week. The group took a short break. Ethan texted her a simple message, "Coffee. I owe you one for listening all those times." She hesitated, then agreed. They met at a small coffee shop near the harbor. The afternoon light shimmered off the water outside the window. They talked for hours about art, about loss, about starting over. There was laughter. But there were quiet moments to those pauses where words fell short and silence said enough. As the sky turned orange, Ethan looked at her and said softly, "I don't think I've ever met someone who understands me like you do." Claire's heart raced. She wanted to respond, but before she could, he continued, "You remind me that there's still good in connection, that it's okay to care again." It was innocent, purely emotional, yet it filled the air between them with something impossible to ignore. From that day on, they spoke more often. Short texts, thoughtful questions, gentle check-ins. Nothing inappropriate, yet every message carried weight. Their bond became a quiet lifeline in both their lives. But deep down, Claire knew something had to give. She wasn't naive. She knew emotional attachment could turn into dependency. She'd learned that lesson before. Still, she couldn't bring herself to cut it off. There was something healing in their connection, something that reminded her of who she used to be before life dulled her spark. Then came the day. Dr. Reynolds announced the therapy group was ending. The program had reached its conclusion. "You've all made wonderful progress," she said, smiling warmly. "Remember, growth doesn't end here. You take what you've learned and keep building from it." The group celebrated with lunch afterward. Laughter filled the air, but under the table, Claire felt her heart sink. This might be the last time she saw Ethan. When they stepped outside afterward, Ethan walked with her to her car. The late afternoon breeze swept through the trees. He stood there for a moment, hands in his pockets, looking uncertain. Then he said quietly, "I'm really glad I met you, Claire. You've changed how I see people." She smiled, fighting the ache in her chest. "And you reminded me how to feel again," she replied. He looked at her, the silence between them stretching. There was so much neither could say, not because it was wrong, but because it was fragile. Breaking it might ruin what they had built. Maybe that's enough, he said finally. Maybe that's what this was meant to be. Claire nodded, her eyes stinging. Maybe. They said goodbye, and he walked away, his figure fading down the sidewalk. She stood there for a long time, watching him go, feeling both heartbroken and strangely at peace. The following weeks felt quieter. Her days went on as usual: work, errands, the small routines of life, but something had shifted inside her. She missed their conversations, but she also realized something profound. Ethan hadn't entered her life to stay. He'd come to awaken something she'd buried long ago, the courage to feel again. Months passed, and Claire continued therapy on her own. She began painting again, something she hadn't done in years. Her art started selling at local galleries, and with each piece, she felt freer. She found herself smiling more, sleeping better, and embracing her solitude not as emptiness, but as space to grow. One spring morning, as she set up her art display at a local fair, she heard a familiar voice behind her. "I knew you'd end up doing this," Ethan said, smiling. She turned, surprised but happy. He looked different, calmer, grounded. They talked for a while, catching up. He told her he had started volunteering at a community center, helping others the way Dr. Reynolds had helped him. Claire felt genuine pride. "You found your peace," she said warmly. He nodded. "You helped me see it was possible." As they said goodbye again, there was no sadness, this time only gratitude. They had both healed in ways they hadn't imagined. Some connections, Claire realized, weren't meant to last forever. Some existed just to bring light into dark places. That night, Claire wrote in her journal, "Healing doesn't always come from the people we expect. Sometimes it comes from strangers who teach us how to feel again. Then let us go." She smiled as she closed her notebook. The sound of rain pattering softly outside her window. Her heart no longer ached the way it once had. It was full, quietly, beautifully full. And somewhere out there, she knew Ethan was living his life too, carrying a piece of her story with him, just as she carried his dot. Not every story ends in forever. Some end in understanding, and that can be just as powerful.